So we've been reporting on where kind of the big news layoffs that are starting to happen that are being attributed to AI. But what we've not done is really kind of made that link into the whole macro financial world and then into what does this mean for society. So Phil, you're a really interesting guy. Why don't you introduce yourself to everybody, and then I'll take us through agenda for today.
Okay, well, thanks, Ben, for inviting me on. Gosh, I've never been described as interesting before, but that's a great thing. Who am I? Right, so I've been an investment banker for most of my career, apart from a few breaks when I was fortunate enough to become a financial journalist. The problem with being a financial journalist, you don't get paid. So I rejoined the City of London, and I've spent most of half my career in debt capital markets, where I ran what we called the financial institutions team. And then after the global financial crisis of 2007, I decided to break out and get involved in the new markets which were developing around private capital markets. And that's things like private equity, but especially private credit. And I sort of realized that you had to go in with a view. So I started writing a morning commentary for all my clients. And I thought I needed to give it some kind of sparkling name. So I called it Blain's Morning Porridge, a healthy market commentary to get your day started. And that's kind of taken off over the last 18 odd years. I now have over 7,000 subscribers, many of them who actually pay me for it, although clients get it free, of course. And in that commentary, I find myself talking about everything from tech to interest rates to inflation to what's going on, the latest stories out of Tesla, whatever. I've developed a number of real interests over the last few years in how the macro systems are going to react to the changing world that we find ourselves in. And of course, AI is one of the key components of change alongside everything else that's going wrong in the world.
Yeah, indeed. I think I think when we think about AI change and what gets the headlines is impact on people, right? And so I wanted to kind of go through an agenda today. Let's start with a announcement by Dario Amodi, who's the CEO of Anthropic. I'll play that announcement. Just it was a couple of weeks ago now, where he's talking about very real numbers in terms of impact on job role. Phil, you've talked about something called the barista problem that I think is really interesting to draw that as an analogy. So we'll have you explain the barista problem, please, and then I want to get into people and productivity. So, okay, less people, does that mean businesses can grow, and kind of go through a little bit of a movement and then into how this is going to impact civilization, right? So only a small agenda today, Bill.
Look, I've come up with a theory in my morning commentary, which I call the barista event horizon. And within that, you can really sum up many of the themes that are going to occur as AI becomes more and more influential on the jobs market. And one of these is a barista, one of the most highly skilled jobs on the planet. If you cannot get a decent cup of coffee in the morning, then I can assure you that society will shortly collapse following that. And we are getting to that stage. Now, obviously, AI is not going to replace coffee makers, but we do have a problem that in London, it's almost impossible for anyone to get themselves a rental flat unless they are earning well above the average wage. Now, baristas fall into the fairly low paid bracket, and they cannot afford to rent space there. And if we see the number of jobs start to collapse, so there'll be more and more people going for fewer jobs in that bottom half of society, then that means fewer and fewer people are going to be taking jobs like baristas. And that's one of the things we need to apply as a macro part of the equation to what happens to consumption across the whole society if many people find themselves excluded from the job markets because AI has replaced their jobs. Now, on the other side of that equation is I thought it was really interesting when Amazon announced this week that effectively they are looking to reduce the number of white collar workers within the firm, and they're going to use AI to do that. But alongside that, they said they do expect many of these jobs will be replaced with new jobs created by AI. And that's something I think we need to consider as well.
Yeah, and that is kind of coming out with all of these announcements about taking out, oh, we're going to make savings from HR roles, which I think was IBM. And then we had, I think, Microsoft similar, but IBM was like something like thousands of HR roles we're going to take out. But we are actually going to be spending more money on more resource in other areas. So that's your point there of, yeah, we're taking out people over here, but we're creating different job roles over here. But your barista problem is, I thought, really interesting because the barista effectively gets priced out, so they can't even afford to travel into central London now to be the barista. They have to move further and further out. And is AI going to have a very similar impact?
Well, look, let's stick on this theme about highly skilled but not very well rewarded jobs where you can't afford to actually live in cities, which is a problem we very much have today. That's likely to be magnified because if there is little demand for workers to go in and do things like that, because the ultimate is if you have 80% of the number of workers in a city that they used to have, that is 20% less demand for a delicious cup of coffee every morning, which means rather than the scarcity of baristas resulting in them getting paid more, they probably end up paid the same if they're lucky, which means they still can't afford to live anywhere near the place. So the economy will have to readjust. Now, maybe at some point we find an optimization where the value of a barista is recognized and they get paid properly. I mean, in my opinion, baristas should be right up there with brain surgeons, where you come across a person can make a really good cup of coffee.
Yeah, I
But
tend
at
to
the
agree.
same time, AI is not going to make a good cup of coffee. AI is not going to build the flats which are going to make it possible for AI for baristas to live in the center of London. AI are not going to solve the supply chain problems that will slow down the building of modular construction that would make that flat building easy. AI might be able to solve some of the planning bottlenecks and some of the sourcing problems that occur. So yeah, I'm not saying let's be Luddites, which I think would be one other approach about AI, but let's consider what the economic implications are on consumption. Because if you reduce consumption, as Dario was suggesting, with 20% of the population no longer working and consuming resources, in other words, eating up welfare budgets and still wanting healthcare, then the economy becomes unkind of balanced. So what we need to do, or what we need to think about, is how do you keep the economy in balance so that AI makes it better, but means we get growth that everybody shares in? Do I sound dangerously socialist at this point, I wonder?
Yeah, you do sound, it is a socialist concept. And we talked about that moment. I think you mentioned to me the Beveridge report, so post World War II. And it was I think you wrote about this somewhere about a reset moment. Is this the reset moment for capitalism where, yeah, it does need to suddenly start looking about more socialist ideas? What about universal basic income? Is that not a socialist idea?
The reality is that AI is going, we're very aware that AI is going to change the nature of employment. And I suppose the points I'm raising here about how do we make employment better, but also maintain the economy by ensuring that everyone can consume. And I think there's a number of different ways. And you're quite right to raise the idea of a reset in the economy. Now, we have an enormous problem at the moment in the UK that effectively, like every single other Western economy, we are bankrupt because of the amount of debt that has been created. Now, most
Yes.
of that debt was actually run up during COVID, and that's why nations are struggling to balance the books. And now, if you're in I mean, one of the things I do is bond markets. I keep saying in bond markets there is truth. And we've had a couple of bond market shocks. The biggest one, of course, being Liz Truss when she nearly sank the gilts market. That's the UK's government bond market a few years ago. And that has put the living fear of God into governments that they have to be very careful to balance the books. Now, I take again a slightly different view that any government that demonstrates political competency and a solid plan should be able to finance that plan by borrowing and also creating growth. Now, if I sound a little bit too much like Rachel Reeves praying for growth to pay out before she had to raise tax rises, that is not deliberate. That's what I think could happen. Now, how would you do that? You've got to address the major problems in the economy, and they are ones that could use AI to solve. So you talked about there about the beverage report. Now, I would argue the beverage report is one of the reasons we won the last unpleasantness with Germany, because it gave soldiers something to fight for. Instead of coming back to the land of heroes, which led to the Great Depression of the 1920s, the soldiers of World War II came back to a nation that, yes, invented the health service, but also had a massive housing program. And that housing program was actually one of the things that kicked off the recovery of the UK economy. Now, my number one priority for the UK just now would be to build houses. Well, not actually houses, but to build flats in inner cities so that young people, the kind of baristas that we were talking about, but also
Yeah.
any professional in London earning less than double the average London wage. And the London wage is 44,000. That's the average UK, the average London wage. But on 44,000, you cannot begin to hire to rent a flat. You're going to get some crack den above a fish and chip shop in Camberwell for that. You're going to have double that kind of salary if you're going to get anywhere decently. And since people have no security of accommodation, even young professionals, they cannot start the business of family formation, which means they have very little incentive to remain involved in the economy. But if you were to build affordable rental flats and they got these flats and they were prioritized, workers prioritized to get these social flats like the old council housing when you and I were young, then they can start booming the economy because they'll be motivated to participate. That's the first problem. Build lots of flats. It would create a housing boom, which would create growth, which would create lots of jobs, even though, because you know what? There ain't an AI that's going to be able to knock together bricks and mortar and timber to build homes. But on the back of that, we have the second biggest problem that the UK has, which is in healthcare. Now, healthcare is absolutely something that AI could solve. At the
Mm.
moment, the National Health Service is a bottomless pit, consuming any amount of money we throw into it. If we were to look at it slightly differently, and here's a simple scenario for you. If we were to test everybody in the UK, that's about what, 70 million of us, everyone in the UK, all their health records are anonymized and combined. Every year, everyone gets a proper blood test and health check. And you can see straight away from these tests what looks out of kilter with them. And then using that database of the 70 million of us, you would very quickly be able to say, well, that's likely what's wrong with him. And this is maybe the problem with her. And you'd be able to treat them quickly and efficiently. Now, there is no system in place yet to do that. You go into the NHS, and I'm at that age where the NHS is becoming increasingly familiar to me, and you realize that it's completely disconnected. As a result, we have terrible emergency services, but yet fantastic care services. But then once you get older, which is going to be the biggest problem in the UK, that's all farmed out to local authorities who are all bust. So it just doesn't work. AI would be a fantastic way of pulling these things together and possibly creating a better job for a cheaper NHS. So there's your second problem filled. What's the third problem facing the UK? Well, that is financial. It's what I just talked about there. The fact that we are heavily indebted and we need growth to repay it. But also, we face a massive problem that we have so much in the way of government pensions to pay that at some point in the next few years, unless we radically readdress the issue of how to pay pensions, we will be spending about 110% of taxes just paying civil service pensions. So the whole economy needs a rethink. And I'm convinced that AI needs to be part of that. At the same time, we go on to the second part of your question was, how do you ensure that all these people who lose their jobs actually remain participants in the economy? Well, you're quite right. There's two things that these people do. Either they can produce things by working and making me a delicious cup of coffee as a barista in the morning, or they can simply consume. And for them to consume, we need to pay them something. And you called it what, a national living wage, or I can't remember the expression you use, but it's the one that's commonly said, paying
Yeah,
people for
universal
doing nothing.
basic income.
Yeah,
Yeah.
universal basic income. It's incredible. You forget the basic terms at a good time, which is quite worrying. But essentially, you're paying people to consume. It's much like paying farmers to keep fields
To
fallow and grow
keep farming.
wildflowers. But
Yeah.
is it the best use of these people? And will it actually satisfy them? And when you look around some of and let's be honest about it, the sink estates in the UK, you have people who are disappointed because they have no purpose. I think one of the great things that people need is purpose in their lives. I mean, I wish I could work out what mine is. I mean, maybe it's to write a decent market commentary every morning. Maybe it's to do my day job. But at the end of the day, I come back fairly satisfied from doing it. But if all my life consisted of was simply working all day to pay my rent, I would be unhappy. Or if it was just sitting there waiting for the next check so I can go back to the pub or the gambling shop, I would be unhappy. I think it's a fundamental human right that we need to give people purpose in their lives. And that is the part, the AI equation that worries me. When I read people like the head of personnel at Amazon saying, we're confident we're going to be able to replace 20% of our staff with AI. I said, well, aren't your staff the reason your company's successful? They're the stakeholders who've made it work. Don't they count as much as the shareholders? And there I go again, sounding
Mm.
dangerously socialist.
Yeah, gosh, there's a lot in that. That's a brilliant answer to that question, Bill. And yeah, to your point of purpose. Yeah, oh, I get my UBI. Well, what does a human do when not well occupied with a job that they have to go out and do? What do they do with their time? And it's not good, is it? They don't. They don't.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
And you can see. I mean, I come from Edinburgh, and Edinburgh is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. But most people only knew Edinburgh because they watched Train Spotting. That's what happens to you if you have no purpose in life.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and we see that all over the world, don't we? So it's not just Edinburgh. So, uh, Bill, one question I had for you, and there's a lot that you've just said, and I want to come back to a bunch of that. But one question I had for you is it just me, or do our politicians not seem to be talking about this? So we're talking about it, the media are talking about job losses, the politicians kind of are still making the classic announcements. We're going to spend this much on defense, spend this much on social housing, that tax and spend, all of that stuff. Where's the person to say, hey guys, this AI thing that's coming along, what a fantastic opportunity to completely transform healthcare outcomes and therefore take away, what is it, the top one or two things that taxpayer money spent on in the UK is, I think it's the national debt, health, social benefits, that kind of stuff, right? Where are the politicians in all of this? Do you hear them, Bill?
Well, yeah, politics is one of the key elements of this, in fact. And the problem, of course, is that politics is politics. So let's take the problem of the NHS as a starting point, because it is the Gordian knot, the untieable problem at the center of the UK economy. How would you change the NHS when there are so many interests involved in it, i.e., everyone that supplies it, everyone that works for it, finding the staff that are required, but also it's the greatest political football. The Tories, of course, they wanted to totally reform the NHS during their last government. Now, let's be honest, the 14 years of Tory government between 2010 and 2024 was not a brilliant golden age of British politics. It was pretty crap. But one thing they wanted to do was reform the NHS. They just couldn't agree how to do it, and they needed consensus across politics to make it happen because they knew if they reformed the NHS, they would be damned eternally for doing so. Labour, on the other hand, knew that that was one of their strong suites, so they didn't want reform of the NHS. They wanted it to continue embarrassing the Tories. It's a political game. Now Labour are in charge and they're thinking, how do we reform the NHS? Well, you know what? It needs root and branch reform. It needs to be redirected. It needs swift cuts. It needs cross fertilization. It's such a massive change. And I know that within government is being thought about, but is there the resources when government is itself scarce of resources because they are so terrified of the bond market? And maybe we should just talk about the bond market
Yeah,
at the
that's
moment, because the
really
bond
important.
market is the most important, powerful force on the planet today. It is the bond market, the discipline that it imposes on governments on how they spend, that determines how economies are going to function in the future. And at the moment, the bond market is very concerned that Western economies have spent too much money and lack the political competency to get themselves back on track. Now, I recently spoke at it was a Chatham House type rules event talking about UK housing. And I did actually come up with the line that the current Labour government is probably the best Conservative government that we've had since, well, Tony Blair's Conservative government.
Yeah,
Tony Blair
yeah.
was Labour as well. But these both times that Labour's been in power recently, they've ended up acting in a very conservative manner because of the discipline that the bond market throws. And this kind of leads us on to a final thing, or on this part of the discussion is, should we really be in thrall to the bond market and the way it operates, or is there a way that we could use the bond market more effectively? And of course, at the back of my mind, I'm thinking about my experience of 40 years in the bond market and what we saw during the era of what we call quantitative easing. And in 2008, of course, we had the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the States, which led to a global financial crisis. All governments around the world got together, cut interest rates to try and avoid a massive global depression, and it worked. But interest rates were extremely low. And when interest rates are low, that means that the rich who own assets find that their assets are very easy to borrow against at very low rates. So they get money and they buy more assets. So the rich get richer. And at the same time, governments, because interest rates are so low, they go and spend more and the debt quantum raises. And then after that period of ultra low interest rates, which caused enormous market distortions, you end up with governments even more highly indebted. But what we did learn during COVID is that when there is crisis, governments can still cut interest rates and get more money. And it wasn't inflationary. And that's the really interesting thing, because generally, when governments borrow too much money and spend it, that creates inflation. But it didn't happen during COVID. It actually took the energy shock of the Ukraine war to kick off inflation, which is why interest rates have moved from 0.5% to near enough 5%. And that makes a major change. And that's why everyone's so worried about the bond market. But if we could solve the problem, if there were magic money trees, we wouldn't be worried about this. But there aren't.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the bond market is effectively a sovereign nation selling its own debt, just help me with this one because I heard recently, like in the last month or so, that for I don't know whether it's the first time ever, but the first time in some time, the US were struggling to kind of auction their debt, and I think there was a similar issue. Perhaps it was in Japan. So they kind of like, do they actually run an auction for treasury debt? Is that how it works, Bill?
That's exactly how it works. Every month or so, all the major, let's keep it to the UK, Japan, and the USA, because these are the ones that really count. We really should talk about Europe, but that's got a different set of problems. Each month or each quarter, they have quarterly refundings in the States and regular gilt auctions here in the UK and Japanese government bond auctions in Japan. And generally, investors come in and they buy these. Now, the type of investors that buy them are either investors who are buying for the long term, so that would be your pension fund or your insurer, or it might be investors who think that rates are going to come down, so they start buying bonds. Because the funny thing about bonds is the lower interest rates are, the more expensive the bonds get. So when interest rates rise, as they are threatening to do just now because of Donald Trump's tariff regime, which is crushing global trade, interest rates will go up because of the inflation it will create. If inflation starts, interest rates go up. As a result, everyone started selling bonds. So the Japanese gave an auction and nobody came. And as a result of that, everyone started panicking. Now, the reality is that the UK in particular has a very well managed gilt market. It's managed by the Debt Management Office, which is part of the UK Treasury, and they do a very good job raising money for the economy. But they're also very, very aware that nations can only use the bond market if they demonstrate three things. Now, I call these three things the virtuous sovereign trinity. There you are. It's an original Bill Blain theory, the virtuous sovereign trinity. And that is that any nation that has a stable currency, a sustainable bond market, and political competency will tend to do very well. But if you lose any of these things, it runs into trouble. And if you think back to when you and I were kids back in 1992, and we had the crisis in the UK over sterling in the European exchange rate mechanism, that was an example where stable currency upset the whole of the UK market. To correct that, in a single day, UK rates went from about 10% to 18% and back down. That was an enormous shock, and it
That's
was well
yeah.
addressed at the time. We also saw the problem with political competency, and I mentioned Liz Truss earlier. When she wrecked the economy by announcing she was going to borrow loads and loads of money on an unfunded basis to fuel growth, everyone went, "What is this woman smoking?" And
Yeah.
the gilt market almost collapsed. The risk at the moment is that in the next couple of months, rising inflation and declining economic performance in the US will demonstrate just how badly Trump has cost the political competency of the USA. And if
Yeah.
that happens, you may see bigger problems for the US Treasury market. But these are all things I don't see an immediate AI solution for. This is the background to how we address the AI revolution.
Yeah, and as you're talking, going back to a point you made before about the NHS. So if we think about that kind of trinity or the bond market wanting well-run budget. So if you take NHS, which like for anyone listening to this who's not in the UK, NHS, just the largest employer, I believe, in the whole of Europe. It's just a colossal organization. And as Bill said, it doesn't matter how much money you give it, it gets spent. Now, the piece around that Bill you mentioned before was, and this is where I want to then segue into, well, how could AI help this if it doesn't directly help that kind of debt bond challenge that you just outlined? Well, if AI can stop people getting sick, and by because I've
That
got my
helps.
Garmin watch on, and typically in this country, you go to, and then you've got your Apple, whatever the device is. Everyone's got these devices. So if that's measuring my blood pressure, my heart rate, it knows how much I sleep, and maybe it knows my dietary habits, how much alcohol I drink, smoking, whatever. It knows about me, and it can start helping me proactively avoid me getting sick, thus avoid me rocking up to the NHS and saying, hey, I now have type 2 diabetes, and now I need some expensive drugs to help me, and scans and knock on effects of that. Is that where AI comes in to reduce the demand going into the front end of a giant health organization like the NHS? Is that what we're saying here? So we're not actually using AI to try and transform the NHS. How many times have we heard that over the decades? No, we're stopping people arriving there in the first place.
Yeah, you turn it towards prevention rather than cure. And this is the point I'm making about everybody who's on the NHS's multiple appalling databases all being combined together, that data being used by AI to manage effective treatment. Now, let me give you another example of that. I mean, my father-in-law, who's a great bloke, is getting elderly. He calls it a full house, full bingo card of what's wrong with him. He's got everything from
Oh no.
diabetes to a
Oh
need for a
dear.
hip replacement, right the way around to heart failure. We go
Poor
and
guy.
see his GP. He's smiling. He's always smiling. We go and see his GP, and she's got literally 10 minutes for every patient. And she's a
Yes.
great GP because she took the time to analyze everything to work out, well, if you're doing this, actually, if you give him that drug, that's going to hurt that and make that worse. She worked all this out. And AI could have done that in moments, giving her the time to actually say, look, Alwyn, we got to do this to make you better. And these are the issues that AI can solve. Yes, it's prevention, a cure. And if that happens and we can make the NHS work to a budget, then we have the money to spend on other things. And this then goes back to the problem that you've raised with your living wage kind of comments, paying people for not working. Well, that means they're consuming all these resources, which means there's even less money to spend on all these things. But the rest of us who are still trying to work, we then have to pay more in taxes, which any right winger is going to tell you is unfair
Yes.
and is not right. Why should I be paying their costs? And that's a fair comment. But we also need to think about how we tax, because one of the things I'm looking at the moment is this big, beautiful bill in the US to change and cut taxes. Now, that is actually going to impact with higher taxes for the bottom quartile of society, who, funnily enough, tend to be MAGA voters. And the people who benefit most are the top 5% of the US economy, the ones who are already stinking rich already. We do need to have a think. And again, yet another case of dangerous socialism from a man who actually voted Tory in the last election. I am going to
Yeah.
suggest we tax the rich fairly. And that means, in some cases, till the pips squeak.
Yeah, so we've got big beautiful bill. We've also got a giant bunker bomb being dropped somewhere in Iran. So that's all kind of going on at the moment. And so terrible events going on in the world, which drives spending on defense, right? That's, it all has that impact on we're going to spend more on defense. Okay, well, we're straight back to the bond market again, aren't we? And then you've got taxation, you've got possible, then of course, societal issues going on here. And it strikes me, Bill, the problem we have when you look at how our politics is set up is we work in election cycles and they take 4 or 5 years, right? But this technology is getting 1,600 times better every year. And so we don't, it doesn't, that pace of change, when you compare it to, say, the Industrial Revolution, well, the Industrial Revolution took some time. Obviously, it's transformation, but it took time to build the factory. Well, the factories are getting built, literally the AI factories, which is the term in the business now. The AI factories are getting built so fast, it doesn't allow that debate, how democracy works, which requires time and generally what, 2 or 3 election cycles to agree how we're going to manage a societal change.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the history, and I'm a great one for economic history. The history of mankind is a constant series of revolutions in the way that we work and the way that societies operate. And there have been times where we have seen very, very swift societal revolution. And one of the great ones everyone likes to quote is the Black Death. The
Right.
Black Death in the
Yes.
1580s, whenever it was, half of the British agricultural workforce were wiped out. They died. Yeah, that was the best thing to happen to the ones that survived because suddenly their labor was worth more. And that's what ended feudalism. And that's what sent people to the cities where they learned new trades and they became, the proletariat of the day got wealthy because they were able to use their skills and experience. Now, what we're likely to see here is going to be another societal change. And yes, it will happen very quickly because we're building it all. And I don't think we've even analyzed the risks yet. I mean, one of the things that scares me about AI, and let me make me clear that I am not against AI at all. I think it's going to be enormously useful. But I also think we need to double check it and we need to take time to do that. One of the things that scares me about AI is where does AI do its learning? We all think that AI is scraping everything, single thing that guys like you and I write, and all the pop songs and all the great novels of the last 300 years, whatever. But if you actually look at the numbers, they're quite scary. The biggest learning source for AIs is other AIs, which means if there's an error in one, it very quickly infects all the other. So we need to be very careful about how we check AI. And we also need to be very careful about who owns and benefits from AI. I mean, the moment that Mark Zuckerberg or Sam Altman figure out how to embed advertising revenues from AI, that's the moment we got to really start worrying.
Yeah, and indeed, this is being driven out of the US, isn't it? And then the Sam Altmans of this world will say to a politician in the US, when they're told, "Hey, should you guys slow this down a bit?" Their response is, "Well, we can, but then China will get this first. Do you want that to happen?" And so it just seems like it just seems like there needs to be, but at least in the US, you hear the conversation. In the UK, you don't hear any conversation about this. So, and then back to yes, you've still got the traditional big, beautiful bill. You've still got the Rachel Reeves, our Chancellor of the Exchequer, doing the traditional old announcement with the budget. And it's like, guys, this thing is coming. Where's the person talking about how we're going to leverage it? in the UK, because I wouldn't mind a
Where's the
couple of Sam
person
Altmans over
pulling
here.
all the bits together?
Yeah,
Where is the person who's going to get the and think about how do we optimize this so that the economy gets better because of AI? It creates the growth that allows us to pay all the associated costs around that and ends up in the whole economy and all the stakeholders of the economy being better off. Now, the problem in the States, and I'll be brutally frank about it, is the financialization of everything. Everything in the States is seen about shareholder returns.
sure.
The reason that I want to be here is because I think that the way that Europe, including the UK, is going to work, because we're going to have a better society that is about stakeholder returns. And as a citizen, you're a stakeholder. And that means you got to be treated fairly. And that means there's all kinds of other issues that we need to address, which none of which are easy. Things like where do we get our energy from? Where do we dispose our waste? How do we clean up the environment? These are all big issues for society, and AI will not solve them, but AI can be part of the solutions. But you're quite right. Who's pulling this all together? Because let's take a look at UK politics for the moment. UK politics is a spectrum. I'm not talking about the typical left-right spectrum. It's a spectrum between those who are trying to manage with the finances they've got and making difficult decisions to do the right thing, right the way across to somewhere in the middle. You have people and saying, well, why aren't you doing that? You should have done that. Remember, we would have done it this way. And then at the other end, you have people who said, well, because we're going to get rid of immigration, the country will thrive and we'll all be able to borrow much more money and everything will be solved. So you've got a common sense to an absolute fairy tale fug. I mean, immigration is a problem because it's been made a populist problem. It's actually a rounding error in the actual economics of the thing. You know, two and
Yeah.
a half billion on hotels for illegal refugees. That doesn't even rattle the tin.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. It gets the headlines, but actually that if we're worried about base economics, it's just
I
not a
suppose
factor, right?
I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that politics at the moment is very muddied by populism, seizing popular themes, and people thinking that these are more important than they actually are. The big issues we need to solve are the ones you talked about a few moments ago, which is how do you pool all these streams together to make the economy better, to make everything within it function better, which AI can do, yet keep the economy functioning by giving people purpose and a reward for participating in it.
Yeah, and fascinating. And just looking at the time as well, the other thing that you said there, where we could do a whole podcast episode on its own, is energy. And if everything is a function of the cost of energy, how do we use, in the same way we use AI to drive it down the front end of the NHS pipeline of people getting sick in the first place, how do we use AI to drive down the cost of energy? Wouldn't that be stunningly helpful?
Well, this actually could end up being very, very interesting indeed, because AI is changing the way that things happen. Now, there are two things that I've been watching since I first watched Star Trek 50 years ago, and that is quantum computing, which they always say is going to happen tomorrow, and then there is fusion energy, basically unlimited power. And recently, it's become clear that quantum computing is getting much closer. And I'm told that one of the reasons for that is that being able to apply AI to some of the basics and cut the costs means that people can concentrate on solving the problem of qubits, which is the way that quantum computing works. So you can actually
Mm.
qubits break down. I can't even start to explain it, but just use that word qubits. It sounds like I know what I'm talking
Qubits. Yeah,
about.
it does make
Um,
sound
the
very.
thing
Anyone
is,
that says
qubits
that
will
word
break
is
down and make
intelligent.
mistakes, but if you can correct these mistakes using the power of AI, it works. Now, the same thing may end up happening faster with fusion. Now, we've actually got to the stage where I think the French were able to keep a fusion reaction going for more than a couple of minutes. Now, that is massively significant. At some stage, we may end up solving the energy problem. But the other part of the energy problem is the way that we use energy. Now, I am not a great fan of crypto. Yet, if it continues to grow the way it is, we'll be using 99% of all the power generated in the world to fuel Bitcoin mining, which is essentially economically useless. We got to think these things through, people.
Look, Bill, I know you've joined today. I think you're away next week, and so I'm really glad that we got you on today before you disappear. I know you're not in your usual spot, so your internet connection's not everything that you no doubt love it to be. But we that was a fascinating conversation. So grateful. Where do people find you, Bill, and how do people sign up for daily updates?
Okay, well, you can find the Morning Porridge on www.morningporridge.com. All one word, Morning Porridge. And
Include.
you get 3 free reads a month if you don't pay. But of course, I'd rather you did, and you'll find it interesting.
Yeah, no doubt at all, Bill. So yeah, everyone go to morningporridge.com, go sign up for the daily newsletter. It's really good. Bill, it's been a fascinating conversation. I'll drop the links into the show notes and yeah, you have a great trip next week. And thanks for making time to join the AI Outcomes
Brilliant. I think
podcast
we've
today.
just, thanks very much.